Harvard Divinity School.
Uses and abuses of power in alternative spiritualities. Implications for spiritual care of patients and communities. April 28, 2023.
So I was born into the Sikh Dharma 3HO, or Healthy, Happy, Holy Kundalini Yoga organization. We have many names. I was born into this community in 1978 at the Mahadeva Ashram in Tucson, Arizona. My parents, like others who came into the community at the time, mostly white American middle-class youth from Judeo-Christian backgrounds, were part of the countercultural movement, questioning existing sociocultural religious norms. They sought ways to expand their consciousness on a quest for spiritual experience and found value and benefits in the teachings of Yogi Bhajan, also known as Siri Singh Sahib and Harbhajan Singh Puri. These practices incorporated these values and benefits and teachings incorporated Sikh and yogic practices and concepts to live a healthy, happy, holy lifestyle. I was raised as a Khalsa Sikh in a community of practitioners wearing a turban and all-white bana or Sikh clothing to school, eating a vegetarian diet, waking up before the sunrise every morning for our daily sadhana practice, reciting Guru Nanak's Japji, doing Kundalini Yoga, going to Gurdwara, and singing Sikh Kirtan. While the yoga and Sikh practices offered a pathway to live a healthy, happy, holy lifestyle, in presentations and publications, I would proclaim that the yogic and Sikh practices create these conscious practitioners and consumers who live in harmony with others, animals, and our environment. I would often quote the spiritual teacher, Yogi Bhajan's axiom, if you can't see God in all, you can't see God at all. I would argue that he empowered women by appointing female leadership in Sikh religious and business spaces because their caliber, consciousness, and self is 16 times stronger than all the men. I referred to his teachings as feminist because in his lectures, he demanded that women, I quote, no longer be mistreated or exploited. And he says, this is a quote, I ask every man who would seek peace to realize that peace doesn't come by protests and rallies, peace comes by peaceful actions. And so long as those born of the mother will not learn words are painful. Okay, those born of the mother will not learn to respect women. There shall not be any peace on this planet. The day the woman will not be exploited on this planet, there shall be peace on the earth. Okay, so then, but now, Yogi Bhajan's words feel tainted as the community is awakening to the reality of sexual misconduct, manipulation, and abuse by the spiritual teacher. He passed away in 2004. The hypocrisy of the teacher and the lasting repercussions of pain inflicted by absolute power with those of the inner circle enabling abuses and silencing dissenting voices. In January 2020, Pamela Sahara Dyson, AKA Premka, published a memoir about her time serving as Yogi Bhajan's right-hand woman as Secretary General from 1969 to 1984. Her narrative captures the spiritual quest of the young countercultural generation and their orientalizing attitudes that exoticized Indian spirituality, granted yoga teachers enlightened status and overwhelming spiritual authority, making the devoted student ripe for abuse. She shares how her spiritual longing as a bhakti devotee in love with her teacher manifested into a sexual relationship and a complicated abortion. She explains how from the beginning, Yogi Bhajan prophesized how those closest to him would stab him in the back, implanting the idea that anyone who spoke against him was treacherous, full of doubt, duality, negativity, and slander, and would reap this karma in their next lives. Yet, for too long has karmic-driven logic allowed for abuse, turning a blind eye to the inequality and injustices of the world. For too long has karmic logic allowed men to abuse women in the name of their own liberation. Twisted karmic logic implies that the structural inequalities in the world, such as sexism, casteism, racism, and poverty, and the abuses individuals experience are due to the choices that these oppressed people made in the past. Such a logic relinquishes perpetrators from any sense of responsibility for the harm they cause, blaming the victim, and does not address corrupt systems. How can people be empowered as responsible agents of their own karma when they are treated as objects within an oppressive system of imbalanced power relations? While many community members continue to embrace Sikhism and Kundalini Yoga, some are questioning the authority of Yogi Bhajan, the authenticity of his teachings, and the appropriation of Sikhi. Others are proclaiming their loyalty to the teacher and the teachings, denying the abuse and calling it slander perpetrated by toxic people with negative agendas. The discursive apparatuses around Yogi Bhajan and his teachings have operated in such a way to perpetuate systems of violence by deifying, fetishizing, and commodifying the authority of the teacher and the teachings. Here, it is important to acknowledge that this community consists of a diverse spectrum of practitioners, devotees, and disciples with differing experiences of agency and registers of abuse, with some centering Yogi Bhajan as a sole authority, others centering Sikhi, others it's the yoga. Therefore, it becomes helpful to look at the complexities and nuanced realities of this community in turmoil, rather than reaffirming polarizing or monolithic narratives that paint the community as either a Bhajanist cult that appropriated Sikhi or an idealized Khalsa Sikh community, either Yogi Bhajan as a fraudulent sociopathic sexual predator or an enlightened master, the Kundalini Yoga he taught as entirely made up or an inauthentic ancient practice adopted and taught by, or an authentic ancient practice adopted and taught by the Sikh gurus. Given the contrasting experiences, beliefs, and perspectives, it is important to acknowledge that the truth lays somewhere in the messy in between. The polarization, cognitive dissonance, and antagonism being experienced within the community echo the painful processes of uprooting structural and systemic abuses of power, now also happening on national and global scales. Although rumors had circulated for several years about sexual impropriety, and at least 2 lawsuits had been filed against Yogi Bhajan in the 80s, the book, Premka's book, going back to that memoir, it hit a Me Too moment in the 3HO community. It was believed at face value, and it was devastating to those who had dedicated their lives to upholding the ideals and practices of Sikhi and yoga that he had preached. It unraveled layers of communal abuse and neglect, particularly expressed by many of those in the second generation, who in 2020 gathered on Zoom and shared and openly shared their experiences as children growing up in the community, sent to live with other families or to boarding schools in the US and India, some as young as 5 years. Which impacted their development and their growth. Many reported being neglected, always hungry, told that the hardship would make them strong leaders of tomorrow. I always think I could speak about these things without getting emotional, but I do. Okay. So at this meeting, the second generation were given space to share their experiences being raised in the community and at boarding school in India. What was meant to be a 1-hour session ended up lasting 11 hours, with 200 people joining by virtue of the Zoom platform. It was an exhausting, heartbreaking, powerful, and courageous marathon, with some women from the second generation coming forward about the sexual grooming and assault they had experienced at the hands of Yogi Bhajan We're always taught to say, yes, sir. There was never a no. With others from the second generation, sharing their experiences of the neglect, abandonment, bullying, and abuse they experienced at the boarding schools in India and in the homes of various Sangat members whom they were sent to live with at young ages. At 2.5 years, Yogi Bhajan sent me to live with a family in Los Angeles. He wanted me to learn how to respect a spiritual teacher, to touch his feet and greet him with flowers and a smile. My mother had a desire to be a good student who listened to the teacher. And while she knew positive attachment between parent and child was necessary for healthy development, she also put faith in his enlightened vision of what her child needed to grow into her highest destiny. Like many of our parents, she was in her 20s when she joined the community, changed her name, leaving behind her Swedish evangelical preacher father and missionary family, dedicating herself to the 3HO Sikh Dharma path. Still, she would write letters to Yogi Bhajan, calling out abuses of power, questioning unhealthy attitudes, asking why critical thinking was silenced as negative or slander, why fear of the outside controlled the community, why cozy and loving families were considered weak, why community members were overworked and undervalued, and asking how to create a caring and supportive Sangat. She wrote, "My question is, how can we have community without communication? I'm tired of being considered negative because I raise questions and have my own ideas. I'm tired of people insinuating that it is slander to talk about a bad situation, even if it is true, and even if the goal is to make it better. There seems to be so much fear which limits growth and keeps the community under control. If we have faith that what we value cannot be lost or taken away, how can we be afraid of a free and open exchange of all kinds of creative thoughts and dissenting viewpoints or ideas for exchange? Faith has to be fundamental to growth and success, and genuine caring for people is necessary in a healing community." So she had like 3 bullet points. I'll just name them. 1, how should I support the Sangat without supporting the harmful behavior? 2, how should I communicate with a community that resists communication? 3, how does a seeker find the experience of Sangat? And she doesn't remember receiving any meaningful response to her queries. Yogi Bhajan separated children from families, telling parents that they were either too neurotic or too coddling to raise their own children, to become strong, independent saint soldiers or sant sapai. Because of this spiritual logic and out of devotion to their teacher, many of the second generation children were sent to live with other families in the early 80s. While some were lovingly cared for as part of the family, others were just another mouth to feed, having to work like servants in those households or being transferred from house to house. Some witnessed domestic violence and some were given spiritual punishments like being thrown into cold showers, made to hold a yogic posture, meditate for hours in an effort to change their behavior, some shamed for the way they spoke, acted, or dressed. This has had long-lasting negative effects in inhibiting their ability to meditate, do yoga, or maintain healthy habits and boundaries today. The depth and breadth of abuse and open-hearted sharing of the second generation, it offered a wake-up call to the first generation, with various ways people are responding to acknowledging and grappling with the reality that the community in which their children was raised was not the idyllic community we all hoped or blindly believed it to be. Those second generation who were part of the systemic culture of bullying and abuse in the schools have come forward to ask for forgiveness, offering a model for the first generation to acknowledge their own complicity in either perpetuating or stopping cycles of abuse. The second generation are now discussing what accountability looks like when some of their parents continue to hold fast to their loyalty to Yogi Bhajan, rather than believe their own children, continuing to demonstrate patterns of silence and denial. They are asking what it takes for their voices to be heard, to receive acknowledgement, accountability, and how to prevent future abuse. With some organizing lawsuits and others participating in a reparations program established by the overarching SSSC board that runs the businesses and organizations in the community. And here's an open letter from the second generation asking, please listen. Listen to our stories. What does it mean for a community of practitioners who have spent the past 50 years dedicated to spreading the light when there is so much darkness in the shadow? The organization is now calling for a path of restorative justice to reimagine healthy, happy, holy systems, communities, and bodies. Let's see. A State of the Community Global Survey was sent out via Facebook by a group from the second generation to gauge how those in the global community are feeling to reimagine a path forward. It received 607 responses from people identifying across the board from 3HO, Kundalini Yoga, Sikh Dharma, and students at the India schools. Most respondents were Kundalini Yoga practitioners from North America and Europe who had been with the organization from 6 to 20 years, with a sizable portion having been in the community 20 plus years. The majority of the results indicated that being a member of the community was part of their identity, and being associated with the community makes them feel good overall. However, they do not trust the organizational leadership and believe the structure of these organizations should change significantly. Yet they do feel the organizations are responding appropriately to the allegations. Most found Yogi Bhajan's teachings important to their life and that his lectures should be reviewed for things that are outdated. They do not believe Yogi Bhajan always had his students' best interests in mind. Most found the allegations to be serious in nature and probably true. They feel his picture should no longer remain in community spaces. They are unsure whether they feel hopeful about the future. Those who still value and identify with the broader global community are working to reconcile the abuses and hypocrisy of the teacher with the value that has been found in what he taught, often quoting his saying, "Don't love me, love the teachings, become 10 times greater than me." While many want to cautiously move forward as a community, others see the corruption of the teachers irrevocably corrupting the teachings. On the other hand, the spectrum are those, on the other hand of this end of the spectrum are those, including prominent Kundalini Yoga teachers and heads of the community, who have inextricably tied their own identity to Yogi Bhajan as an enlightened master who cannot be questioned, denying the abuse as slander and betrayal. Their denial is shrouded under the yogic guise of neutrality, to not give in to negativity in order to maintain a high vibration. How are we to move forward as a community when some are not even able to acknowledge the harm done? So some things about moving forward. Thank you. Some are staying to rebuild and others are walking away. Some are trying to make internal systemic change, but it requires rebuilding trust to reimagine community. Most of the organizations have been working to evolve and make amends, but it's imperfect because they're either bound by those who don't want to acknowledge the harm, they don't want to change, or they are perceived, or they're also being perceived as just doing a quick rebrand to continue business as usual. Nevertheless, there are efforts being made to move the organizations and community forward in a new and safe way, with questions of whether this is too little, too late. The current CEO of 3HO spoke about how they're working to promote respect for the tradition and allowing people to practice on their own terms, decentering Yogi Bhajan without canceling, honoring his position as founder and acknowledging the harm, and ultimately trying to center the experiences of the practitioners. So now there has been there was a collaborative response team that was created after the initial allegations of harm. They hired an olive branch to investigate, and it came that there were 75 incidents of abuse and 36 reporters of harm. And the results of that were that the alleged conduct more likely than not occurred. There are also efforts to have compassionate reconciliation groups. They hired an external organization, Just Outcomes, to lead the whole community through a 3-year restorative justice process and engaged in dialogue circles. The organizations have hired DEI and trauma-informed work people to train the staff and the teachers. The youth are now going through a reparations program that was organized by the organization. And the organization has also set up a human rights commission to address systems of harm and inequalities with marriage equality as a key goal. So there have been, they have, their ethics and professional standards listed on their websites. They have the codes of ethics for Kundalini Yoga teachers. They have 10 rights of a Kundalini Yoga student. They've issued acknowledgements and an apology and started independent healing reparations program, yet they're all wanting, that we're left wanting in all of these areas. It's the responsibility of the students to report any breach that happens. I don't know if any Kundalini Yoga student actually knows what their rights and responsibilities are, though it's listed on a website. The apology didn't clearly name Yogi Bhajan as committing harm. So it was an attempt to say that without saying it, but did not say it. And they've started this independent healing reparations program. It's underfunded, it's insufficient, it limits the amount of therapy. People who accept it have to give up their right to sue if new memories come to light later on, because people are just now starting therapy, and there's a lot of lack of transparency within it. So moving forward, this is my conclusion. In my own work, I am now thinking about how we can uproot ego-based exclusivist thinking from our individual and collective consciousness and patriarchal power structures. How we can develop an ethic of care or seva where power is identified as mutual sovereignty based on our interconnectedness rather than self-serving individualism. I look toward the Sikh ideal of the saint warrior, the spiritual warrior, the Sant Sipahi. And as spiritual practitioners who aim to dwell in a state of acceptance, we also need to cultivate an ethic of seva, to not fall into indifference, but to embody the healthy boundaries, discernment, and power of a warrior that stands against injustice and inequality, that fights for justice, for a form of justice that's restorative, so that all may experience freedom and well-being. I've been inspired by Indigenous practices and ways of seeing and being and connecting and sharing stories and songs. I'm inspired by my colleagues in the Department of Theological Studies who have had to deal with the Catholic clergy abuse crisis and who share restorative spiritual practices such as the gift of grief, of tears, of lament through music and art as powerful tools to transform and heal communities by reclaiming and redeeming symbols, images, words, and practices that have been corrupted, not only by the individual perpetrators, but also by the patriarchal leadership structures that have enabled them. And I look to the work of my Sikh sister, Valerie Carr, who speaks of the path of revolutionary love that necessitates tending to our individual and collective wounds by accessing our rage and harnessing our divine outrage in safe containers to create safe spaces for listening to the pain and anger of those who have been harmed, listening with compassion, so that we can reimagine new ways of being healthy, happy, and holy. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, President and Fellows of Harvard College.